Richard Montgomery had everything money could buy, but he understood very little about the people who worked in his mansion. At 62 years old, he owned 3 successful tech companies and lived in a sprawling estate that overlooked the Pacific Ocean. The house had 22 rooms, an indoor pool, and grounds that required a team of gardeners to maintain. Yet despite all his wealth, Richard often felt like a stranger in his own home. His daily routine rarely changed. He woke up at 5:30 each morning, spent an hour in his private gym, then ate breakfast while reading financial reports on his tablet. By 7:15, his driver would take him to his downtown office, where he spent most days in back-to-back meetings with investors, engineers, and business partners. He typically returned home around 8 in the evening, ate dinner alone in his dining room, then retreated to his study to work until midnight. The people who kept his life running smoothly were almost invisible to him. There was Marcus, the head of security who managed the camera systems and alarm codes. There was Jennifer, his personal assistant, who scheduled everything and made sure he never missed important appointments. There was Carlos, the chef, who prepared his meals exactly the way he liked them. And there was Grace, the head housekeeper, who had worked for him for over 8 years. Grace Williams was a woman in her mid-40s who moved through the house with quiet efficiency. She arrived every morning at 6 and left at 4 in the afternoon. Richard knew she was reliable because his house was always spotless, his clothes were always clean and pressed, and fresh flowers appeared in the main rooms twice a week. Beyond these basic facts, he knew almost nothing about her personal life. Grace had a way of being present without being noticeable. She seemed to anticipate what needed to be done before anyone asked. If Richard left papers scattered on his desk, they would be neatly organized by the time he returned. If he spilled coffee on his shirt during breakfast, a clean replacement would appear on his bed within minutes. She moved through the house like a shadow, taking care of everything while staying out of everyone's way. Richard appreciated efficiency, and Grace was certainly efficient. She never bothered him with small talk or personal problems like some of his previous housekeepers had done. She simply did her job and did it well. In his mind, that was exactly what he paid her for. What Richard didn't know was that Grace noticed everything about him and everyone else in the house. She knew that he ate the same breakfast every Tuesday because he was stressed about his weekly board meetings. She knew that he always wore his lucky watch on days when he had important presentations. She knew that he sometimes stood at his bedroom window for long minutes, staring out at the ocean with the expression she couldn't quite identify. Grace also knew things that Richard thought were private. She knew that he called his elderly mother in Ohio every Sunday evening, and that these conversations often left him frustrated because his mother had early-stage dementia and sometimes forgot who he was. She knew that he kept a photo of a woman named Sarah in his desk drawer, and that he looked at it sometimes when he thought no one was around. She knew that he had trouble sleeping and often worked late into the night because he was afraid of lying awake in the dark with his own thoughts. Most importantly, Grace knew that despite all his wealth and success, Richard Montgomery was a deeply lonely man who had spent so many years focused on building his business empire that he had forgotten how to connect with other human beings. She felt sorry for him, though she would never let it show. Grace's background was something Richard had never bothered to learn about. If he had asked, he would have discovered that she had grown up in Detroit, the daughter of a factory worker and a nurse. She had been an excellent student who earned a full scholarship to study psychology at the University of Michigan. After graduation, she had worked as a social worker in some of the toughest neighborhoods in the city, helping families navigate crisis situations and teaching conflict resolution skills to teenagers who had grown up surrounded by violence. She had moved to California 15 years ago after her husband died in a car accident. Overwhelmed by grief and needing a complete change, she had decided to leave social work behind and find something simpler. Housekeeping allowed her to support herself while staying in the background of other people's lives. It was peaceful work that gave her time to heal and think. But Grace had never really stopped being a social worker. Her training had taught her to read people, to notice subtle changes in behavior, and to stay calm under pressure. These skills served her well in Richard's house, where she had learned to navigate the complicated personalities of the various staff members and anticipate the needs of a demanding employer. The other employees respected Grace, though they didn't know much about her either. Marcus, the security chief, appreciated that she never set off alarms or forgot to lock doors. Carlos, the chef, liked that she kept the kitchen spotless and never interfered with his work. Jennifer, the assistant, was grateful that Grace helped manage Richard's personal schedule and made sure he had everything he needed at home. None of them realized that Grace had been quietly observing and learning about the house's security systems, daily routines, and potential vulnerabilities. It wasn't that she was planning anything suspicious. Her social work background had simply trained her to always be aware of her environment and to think about how to keep people safe. On the morning when everything changed, Tuesday, October 15th, the house felt exactly like it always did. Richard followed his usual routine, eating breakfast while reviewing quarterly reports. Marcus was in the security office, monitoring the camera feeds from his bank of screens. Carlos was in the kitchen, preparing ingredients for lunch. Jennifer was in her small office near the front entrance, confirming appointments and returning phone calls. Grace was upstairs in the master bedroom, changing the sheets and organizing Richard's closet. She moved methodically from task to task, her mind focused on her work, but also aware of the sounds of the house around her. She could hear Jennifer's voice downstairs as she talked on the phone. She could hear the faint hum of the security system and the distant sound of gardeners working outside. At exactly 10:15, Richard's driver arrived to take him to an important meeting with potential investors. Richard gathered his briefcase and jacket, said goodbye to Jennifer, and headed out the front door. Grace watched from an upstairs window as the black sedan pulled away from the circular driveway and disappeared through the front gates. The house settled into its usual midday rhythm. Marcus made his rounds, checking doors and windows. Carlos began preparing lunch for the staff. Jennifer worked at her desk, fielding calls and managing Richard's calendar. Grace continued with her cleaning, moving from the master bedroom to the guest rooms on the second floor. Everything seemed completely normal until exactly 11:43 when the front doorbell rang. Jennifer looked up from her computer, slightly surprised. Richard wasn't expecting any deliveries or appointments until the afternoon. She walked to the front door and checked the security monitor, which showed a young man in a brown uniform holding a large package. The delivery truck in the driveway had the logo of a well-known shipping company. Jennifer opened the door, keeping the security chain attached, and started to ask about the package. The delivery man smiled and said he had an urgent delivery that required a signature. He held up an electronic clipboard and stepped closer to the door. That was when Jennifer noticed two other men emerging from behind the hedges that lined the front walkway. They moved quickly toward the door, and suddenly she realized that something was very wrong. She tried to slam the door shut, but the fake delivery man was already pushing against it. The security chain snapped under the pressure, and all three men forced their way into the front hallway. Jennifer stumbled backward, her mind racing as she tried to understand what was happening. The leader of the group, a tall man with cold gray eyes, grabbed Jennifer by the arm and spoke in a voice that was calm but threatening. He told her that they knew the house's owner was a very wealthy man and that they were there to collect some of that wealth. He said that if everyone in the house cooperated, no one would get hurt. He said that if anyone tried to be a hero, people would definitely get hurt. Jennifer's hands were shaking as she tried to think of what to do. The house's alarm system had been disarmed for the fake delivery, which meant that the police weren't automatically notified. The panic button was in Richard's study, but that was on the other side of the house. Her cell phone was in her office, but the men were standing between her and that door. Upstairs, Grace heard voices in the front hallway, but she couldn't quite make out what was being said. She paused in her work and listened more carefully. Something about the tone of the conversation made her uneasy. Jennifer's voice sounded stressed, which was unusual. There were also male voices that Grace didn't recognize. Grace set down the towels she had been folding and moved quietly toward the top of the main staircase. From there, she could see part of the front hallway, and what she saw made her blood run cold. 3 men in dark clothes were standing near the front door, and one of them was holding Jennifer's arm. Grace immediately recognized what was happening, though part of her mind couldn't quite believe it. Richard's house was being robbed. Grace's first instinct was to find a phone and call for help, but she forced herself to stop and think. Her social work training had taught her to assess crisis situations carefully before taking action. She needed to understand what she was dealing with before she made any moves that might make things worse. She crept closer to the staircase railing and listened to what the men were saying. The leader was explaining to Jennifer that they wanted access to Richard's safe, his valuable collections, and any cash or jewelry in the house. He said they had been watching the house for weeks and knew exactly when the owner left for his Tuesday meetings. He said they also knew that only a few staff members would be in the house during the day. Grace realized that these weren't random criminals who had picked the house on impulse. They had done research and made a plan. That made them more dangerous, but it also meant they were probably organized and businesslike rather than panicked and unpredictable. She watched as the men split up to search the house. One stayed with Jennifer in the front hallway. One headed toward the kitchen, probably looking for Carlos. The third one started climbing the main staircase, heading directly toward where Grace was hiding. Grace had maybe 10 seconds to decide what to do. She could try to hide in one of the bedrooms, but the man would probably find her eventually. She could try to run to a bathroom and lock the door, but that would just trap her. She could try to escape through a window, but that would mean abandoning Jennifer and Carlos to face the robbers alone. Instead, Grace did something that would have surprised anyone who thought they knew her. She calmly walked to the top of the staircase and stood where the approaching robber could see her clearly. When the man reached the top of the stairs, he stopped short, obviously not expecting to encounter someone who looked so composed. Grace was standing with her hands visible and empty, her expression neutral but alert. She looked like someone who was prepared to listen and cooperate. The robber, a heavy-set man with tattoos covering his forearms, stared at Grace for a moment, trying to figure out how to handle this unexpected encounter. He had probably expected to find staff members who would be frightened and confused. Instead, he was looking at a woman who seemed almost unsurprised by what was happening. Grace spoke first, her voice steady and calm. She said that she understood the situation and that she wanted everyone to stay safe. She said that she knew where the valuable items in the house were kept, and that she would be happy to help the men find what they were looking for, if that would help them finish their work quickly and leave without anyone getting hurt. The robber was clearly thrown off by Grace's response. Most people, when confronted by criminals in their workplace, would be crying or pleading or trying to bargain for their lives. Grace was speaking to him like a professional who was ready to solve a problem. He told Grace to come downstairs slowly, keeping her hands where he could see them. Grace nodded and did exactly what he asked, moving at a steady pace and maintaining the same calm expression. As they walked down the staircase together, Grace was already thinking several steps ahead, trying to figure out how to protect everyone in the house while giving the robbers what they wanted. When they reached the front hallway, Grace could see that the situation was even more serious than she had initially realized. Jennifer was sitting in a chair, her face pale but her eyes alert. The leader was standing near the front door, holding a gun that he hadn't bothered to hide. The third robber had apparently found Carlos in the kitchen and was bringing him to join the others. Carlos looked terrified. His hands were shaking, and he kept looking around the room as if searching for an escape route. Jennifer was trying to stay calm, but Grace could see the fear in her eyes. The robbers seemed professional and in control, But Grace knew that even professional criminals could become dangerous if things didn't go according to their plans. The leader looked at Grace and seemed to make the same assessment that his partner had made upstairs. This woman was different from the others. She wasn't acting like a victim. She was acting like someone who was prepared to handle a difficult situation. He asked Grace what her job in the house was, and she replied that she was the head housekeeper. She said that she had access to all the rooms and knew where the most valuable items were stored. She offered to show the men where they could find what they were looking for, on the condition that no one in the house would be harmed. The leader studied Grace carefully, trying to figure out if she was being genuine or if she was planning some kind of trick. What he saw was a middle-aged woman who looked competent and trustworthy. Her offer made sense from a practical standpoint. It would save time and reduce the risk of complications if someone knowledgeable could guide them to the most valuable items in the house. But there was something else about Grace that the leader couldn't quite identify. Most people in her situation would be focused entirely on their own safety. Grace seemed to be thinking about everyone in the room, including the robbers themselves. She was treating the situation like a problem that needed to be solved rather than a disaster that was happening to her. What none of the robbers knew was that Grace had dealt with crisis situations many times during her years as a social worker. She had talked angry teenagers out of fights, helped families navigate domestic violence situations, and mediated disputes between people who thought violence was their only option. She had learned that staying calm and treating everyone with respect was often the key to keeping bad situations from becoming worse. Grace was also thinking about things that the robbers hadn't considered. She knew that Marcus, the security chief, was somewhere in the house, probably unaware of what was happening. She knew that Richard sometimes came home early from his Tuesday meetings, which meant he could walk into the situation unexpectedly. She knew that the gardeners outside might notice something unusual if they saw unfamiliar people moving through the house. Most importantly, Grace was already formulating a plan that would give the robbers what they wanted while protecting everyone in the house. It was a plan that would require her to take some significant risks. But it was also a plan that could work if she was careful and smart about how she implemented it. As the leader continued to study Grace, trying to decide whether to trust her offer, Grace remained perfectly still and patient. She had learned long ago that the most important thing in a crisis was not to rush or panic. Good decisions came from clear thinking, and clear thinking required staying calm even when everything around you felt chaotic and dangerous. The clock on the front hallway wall ticked steadily toward noon, and Grace could see that the robbers were starting to feel pressure to move things along. They had probably planned to be in and out of the house within a specific time frame, and delays would make them more nervous and potentially more dangerous. Grace was about to speak again when the leader made his decision. He told Grace that she would show them where to find the most valuable items, starting with Richard's safe and private collections. He said that if she cooperated fully and helped them work efficiently, everyone in the house would be safe. He also made it clear that if she tried to trick them or slow them down, the consequences would be severe. Grace nodded and said she understood completely. She said she was ready to help them find everything they were looking for. What she didn't say was that she was also ready to do whatever it took to protect the people she worked with and to make sure that when this was over, everyone would still be alive and unharmed. As Grace began to lead the robbers toward Richard's study, where the safe was located, she was already thinking about the next steps in her plan. She had bought herself some time and established herself as someone the robbers could work with. Now she needed to use that position to manage the situation and find a way to turn what looked like a disaster into something that everyone could survive. Grace led the three robbers through the house with the confidence of someone who knew every corner and hiding place. As they walked toward Richard's study, she maintained her calm demeanor while quickly calculating the best way to handle what was about to unfold. Behind them, Jennifer and Carlos remained in the front hallway under the watchful eye of the fourth member of the group, who had stayed behind to guard them. The leader, who had introduced himself only as Tom, walked directly behind Grace, his gun held low but ready. The other two men flanked them, their eyes constantly scanning the hallway for any signs of trouble. Grace noticed that they moved like people with military or law enforcement training, which confirmed her suspicion that this was a carefully planned operation rather than a desperate crime of opportunity. When they reached Richard's study, Grace paused at the heavy wooden door and looked back at Tom. She explained that the room had additional security features, including a separate alarm system that would trigger if the safe was accessed incorrectly. She said she knew the proper procedures for disabling these systems, but she wanted to make sure everyone understood that rushing could cause problems. Tom studied Grace's face, looking for any sign that she was trying to delay them or set some kind of trap. What he saw was a woman who seemed genuinely concerned about doing things correctly. Her offer made practical sense, and her calm attitude was actually making his job easier rather than harder. Grace opened the study door and led the men inside. Richard's private office was an impressive room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, expensive artwork, and a massive desk made from reclaimed ship timber. Behind the desk was a portrait of Richard's grandfather, the founder of the family's first business, and behind that portrait was the safe that contained Richard's most valuable possessions. As Grace moved toward the wall safe, she continued talking to the robbers in the same professional tone she had been using. She explained that Richard kept his most liquid assets in this safe, including cash, rare coins, and jewelry that had been in his family for generations. She said there was probably close to $200,000 worth of easily transportable items, which should be more than enough to justify their risk. What Grace didn't mention was that she was also buying time and gathering information. As she spoke, she was listening carefully to how the men responded to each other, trying to understand the group's hierarchy and dynamics. She was also watching their body language, looking for signs of nervousness, impatience, or aggression that might indicate when the situation could turn dangerous. The safe itself was a modern electronic model with both a digital keypad and a backup manual lock. Grace explained that Richard had given her the combination for emergencies, since she was responsible for maintaining an inventory of his valuable possessions for insurance purposes. This was actually true, though Grace had never expected to use this knowledge under such circumstances. As Grace began entering the combination, Tom positioned himself where he could watch both her hands and the hallway behind them. The other two men spread out to cover the windows and the second entrance to the study. Their movements confirmed Grace's assessment that they were experienced and well-organized. The safe opened with a soft electronic chime, revealing several shelves lined with jewelry boxes, document folders, and neat stacks of cash. Grace stepped back and gestured for Tom to examine the contents, maintaining the same helpful attitude she had shown throughout the encounter. Tom handed his gun to one of his partners and began systematically removing items from the safe, examining each piece of jewelry and counting the cash. Grace watched quietly, noting that he seemed to have genuine knowledge about the value of what he was taking. This wasn't someone grabbing random items and hoping for the best. He was making informed decisions about what was worth carrying and what could be left behind. While Tom worked, Grace engaged him in careful conversation. She asked if there was anything specific he was looking for, explaining that Richard had other valuable collections throughout the house that might interest them. She mentioned his rare book collection, his vintage watch collection, and several pieces of artwork that were worth significant amounts of money. Tom paused in his work and looked at Grace with renewed interest. Most robbery victims either refused to cooperate at all or tried to mislead criminals about the location and value of their possessions. Grace was actively helping them maximize their take, which was both unusual and suspicious. He asked Grace directly why she was being so helpful. He wanted to know if she was planning some kind of trick or if she had her own reasons for wanting to see Richard's possessions stolen. Grace's answer was both honest and strategic. She explained that she had worked in crisis situations before and that she knew the most important thing was to keep everyone safe. She said she had no personal loyalty to Richard's possessions, but she did care deeply about making sure that Jennifer and Carlos weren't hurt. She told Tom that if being helpful meant everyone could get through this situation without anyone being injured, then being helpful was the smart choice. This response clearly resonated with Tom, who seemed to appreciate Grace's practical approach to the situation. He told her that his group had no interest in hurting anyone, but that they also couldn't afford to leave empty-handed after taking such significant risks. He said that if Grace could help them find the most valuable items quickly and efficiently, everyone could benefit from a smooth and successful operation. Grace nodded and suggested that they move on to Richard's bedroom, where he kept his watch collection and additional cash. She explained that Richard was somewhat paranoid about keeping all his valuable items in one location, so he had hidden smaller caches throughout the house. She offered to show Tom where these hiding places were located. As they prepared to leave the study, Grace made a suggestion that surprised everyone. She said that it might be more efficient if she could move freely through the house to gather items, rather than having all 4 men escort her to each location. She pointed out that a single person moving through the house would be less likely to attract attention from the gardeners outside, and that she could collect items more quickly without having to explain the location and significance of each hiding place. Tom considered this proposal carefully. It would certainly be more efficient, and Grace had already proven that she was willing to cooperate fully. On the other hand, letting her move around unsupervised would give her opportunities to trigger alarms, call for help, or create other complications. Grace seemed to understand his hesitation. She offered to leave her cell phone with him as a sign of good faith, and she suggested that one of his men could monitor her movements using the house's security camera system. She pointed out that Marcus, the security chief, was still somewhere in the house and would eventually discover what was happening. If that happened while all 4 robbers were clustered together, it could create a confrontation that no one wanted. Instead, Grace suggested a more elegant solution. She could find Marcus and explain the situation to him, presenting him with the same choice she had been given: cooperate and keep everyone safe, or resist and risk turning a property crime into something much more serious. Tom was clearly intrigued by this proposal, but he was also suspicious. He asked Grace how he could be sure that she wouldn't simply warn Marcus and encourage him to call for help or try to fight back. Grace's response demonstrated the depth of her understanding of the situation. She explained that Marcus was a retired police officer who took his job very seriously. If he discovered the robbery on his own, his training would push him to try to stop it, even if that meant putting himself and others at risk. However, if someone he trusted explained the situation to him and presented him with a clear choice between cooperation and confrontation, he would be much more likely to choose the option that kept everyone safe. Furthermore, Grace pointed out that the security cameras Marcus monitored would show exactly what she was doing and where she was going. If she tried to make phone calls or trigger alarms, Tom's men would see it immediately. The camera system that was meant to protect the house could actually be used to monitor her behavior and ensure her continued cooperation. This argument was sophisticated enough to get Tom's serious attention. Grace wasn't just offering to help. She was thinking strategically about how to manage all the moving parts of a complex situation. Her proposals addressed his concerns, while also advancing her own goal of keeping everyone safe. After a few minutes of consideration, Tom decided to test Grace's proposal on a smaller scale. He would let her move freely through the upper floors of the house to collect items from Richard's bedroom and personal collections. One of his men would monitor her movements using the security cameras, while Tom and the 3rd robber would search the lower floors for additional valuables. Grace agreed to these terms and asked for a few minutes to gather the most portable and valuable items from Richard's personal collection. She also asked Tom to make sure that Jennifer and Carlos were comfortable and that they understood what was expected of them. She said that keeping them calm and cooperative was essential to maintaining control of the situation. As Grace headed upstairs alone, she felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. She had successfully established herself as a valuable partner in the robbery, which gave her some influence over how events unfolded. However, she was also acutely aware that she was walking a very thin line between helpfulness and betrayal of her employer's trust. The truth was that Grace's feelings about Richard were complicated. She respected his work ethic and appreciated that he had been a fair employer who paid well and never mistreated his staff. However, she had also observed that he lived in a bubble of wealth that insulated him from the realities most people faced. She had seen him discard expensive items without a second thought and spend more money on single meals than many families earned in a week. Grace didn't believe that Richard deserved to be robbed, but she also didn't believe that his possessions were worth risking anyone's life to protect. Her priority was making sure that she, Jennifer, Carlos, and even Marcus emerged from this situation unharmed. If that meant helping criminals steal from a man who could easily afford to replace what was taken, then that was a price she was willing to pay. In Richard's bedroom, Grace worked quickly but carefully, selecting items that were both valuable and easy to transport. She gathered his collection of luxury watches, several pieces of jewelry that had belonged to his grandmother, and a significant amount of cash that he kept in a hidden compartment in his dresser. She also took a few items of sentimental value, not because the robbers had requested them, but because she thought Richard would want them back more than anything else. While she worked, Grace was also thinking about Marcus and how to approach him. She knew that he made regular rounds through the house, checking doors and windows according to a schedule that she had observed over many months. Based on the time and his usual pattern, he should be in the basement level, checking the mechanical rooms and storage areas. Grace also knew that Marcus carried a radio that connected him to a private security company. If he used that radio to call for help, the situation would escalate rapidly and unpredictably. Police response to a robbery in progress would likely involve SWAT teams, helicopters, and negotiations that could last for hours. The robbers would feel trapped and desperate people made dangerous decisions. Grace's plan was to intercept Marcus before he discovered the robbery on his own, and to present him with a clear picture of what was happening and what his options were. She would appeal to his protective instincts by emphasizing that Jennifer and Carlos were safe as long as everyone continued to cooperate. She would also appeal to his professional judgment by explaining that resistance was likely to turn a property crime into a violent confrontation. As Grace finished gathering items from Richard's room, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. She froze, listening carefully, and realized that the sound was coming from the main staircase. Someone was walking up from the first floor, moving slowly and deliberately. Grace quickly moved to the bedroom doorway and peered into the hallway. She could see Marcus at the top of the staircase, his face set in an expression of concentration and concern. He was holding his radio in one hand and a flashlight in the other, even though the hallway was well lit. His body language suggested that he had noticed something unusual and was investigating. Grace realized that this was the critical moment she had been preparing for. Marcus was about to discover what was happening, and how she handled the next few minutes would determine whether the situation remained under control or spiraled into chaos. She took a deep breath, stepped into the hallway, and called Marcus's name softly. When he turned toward her, she could see the surprise and confusion in his eyes. He had expected to find the hallway empty, and instead he was looking at Grace carrying a bag that obviously contained valuable items from Richard's room. Grace spoke quickly but calmly, explaining that the house was being robbed by an organized group of professionals who had been planning the operation for weeks. She told Marcus that Jennifer and Carlos were safe but being held downstairs, and that the robbers had made it clear that everyone's safety depended on full cooperation with their demands. Marcus's first instinct was exactly what Grace had predicted. His hand moved toward his radio, and she could see him calculating whether he could call for help before anyone stopped him. But Grace continued talking, explaining that she had been working with the robbers to keep everyone safe, and that calling for help at this point would likely turn a property crime into a hostage situation. She told Marcus that the robbers were professional and businesslike, interested in taking valuable items and leaving quickly rather than hurting people or creating unnecessary complications. She explained that she had convinced them to let her move freely through the house because she could help them find what they wanted efficiently, which would minimize the amount of time everyone was at risk. Marcus listened to Grace's explanation with the careful attention of someone who had dealt with crisis situations during his years as a police officer. He understood that she was presenting him with a choice between escalation and de-escalation, and he was experienced enough to know that de-escalation was usually the safer option for everyone involved. However, Marcus also had professional responsibilities that complicated the decision. His job was to protect Richard's property and ensure the security of everyone in the house. Cooperating with criminals felt like a betrayal of that responsibility, even if it was the most practical choice under the circumstances. Grace could see the conflict in Marcus's face as he wrestled with competing obligations. She decided to give him one more piece of information that might help him make his decision. She explained that the robbers had sophisticated knowledge of the house's security systems, daily routines, and staff schedules. This wasn't a random crime, and it wasn't something that could be prevented by heroic action. The best anyone could do at this point was to manage the situation carefully and make sure that no one got hurt. Marcus looked at Grace for a long moment, then asked her a direct question. Did she really believe that cooperating with the robbers was the safest choice for everyone involved, or was she just trying to protect herself? Grace's answer was immediate and sincere. She told Marcus that she had spent her adult life working with people in crisis situations, and that she had learned to recognize the difference between situations that could be safely confronted and situations that required careful management. This was definitely a situation that required management rather than confrontation. She also told Marcus something that surprised him. She said that she was thinking not just about the safety of the staff, but also about the safety of the robbers themselves. These were people who had made bad decisions, but they were still human beings who deserved a chance to complete their crime and leave without anyone getting hurt. Unnecessary violence would be a tragedy for everyone involved, regardless of which side they were on. This perspective was something Marcus hadn't expected to hear, and it gave him new insight into why Grace had been so effective at managing the situation. She wasn't just thinking about tactics and outcomes, she was thinking about the humanity of everyone involved. After considering his options for what felt like several minutes, but was probably only seconds, Marcus made his decision. He would cooperate with Grace's approach and help her maintain control of the situation. However, he also insisted on taking a more active role in managing the security aspects of the operation. Marcus explained that his knowledge of the house's systems and procedures could be valuable in making sure that the robbers got what they wanted without triggering any automated alarms or backup security measures. He offered to help them disable certain systems and avoid certain areas that might complicate their exit from the property. Grace was relieved by Marcus's decision, but she was also impressed by his professionalism. Even while cooperating with criminals, he was thinking about how to do his job effectively and protect the people he was responsible for. Together, Grace and Marcus developed a plan for the final phase of the robbery. Grace would continue gathering valuable items from the upper floors. while Marcus would guide the robbers through the most efficient route for searching the main level of the house. They would coordinate through the security camera system, using hand signals and predetermined movements to communicate without alerting the robbers to the extent of their cooperation. As they prepared to implement this plan, Grace felt cautiously optimistic that everyone would emerge from the situation safely. The robbers had proven to be professional and reasonable, the staff had remained calm and cooperative, and she had successfully prevented the kind of confrontation that could have turned the property crime into a much more serious tragedy. However, Grace also knew that the most dangerous part of any robbery was often the exit, when criminals felt most vulnerable and were most likely to make desperate decisions. She would need to stay alert and continue managing the situation carefully until the robbers were completely gone and everyone was truly safe. The coordinated plan between Grace and Marcus worked flawlessly for the next 45 minutes. Grace continued collecting valuable items from the upper floors, while Marcus guided the robbers through the main level, helping them locate artwork, electronic equipment, and other portable valuables. The security camera system that was designed to protect the house now served as a communication network between the two staff members who were secretly managing the robbery. Tom and his team were impressed by the efficiency of the operation. Instead of spending hours searching through closets and drawers, they were able to focus on the most valuable items and ignore everything else. Grace's knowledge of Richard's collections and Marcus's understanding of the house's layout made their job significantly easier and faster than they had anticipated. By early afternoon, the robbers had collected items worth well over $300,000, far exceeding their original expectations. More importantly, from Grace's perspective, everyone in the house remained calm and safe. Jennifer and Carlos had been moved to the kitchen, where they were comfortable and could stay together. Marcus had disabled several security features that might have complicated the robbers' exit. Grace had maintained her role as a helpful coordinator, ensuring that the operation proceeded smoothly. However, Grace's experience in crisis management had taught her that unexpected developments could happen at any moment, and she remained alert for signs of trouble. Her vigilance proved justified when, at 2:30 in the afternoon, Richard's driver called Jennifer's office line to say that the investor meeting had ended early and that Richard would be home within 20 minutes. Jennifer, who was in the kitchen with Carlos and one of the robbers, answered the phone with a steady voice, but immediately looked toward Grace for guidance. Grace realized that this was the moment she had been dreading throughout the entire ordeal. Richard's early return could turn a successful robbery into a chaotic confrontation that might end with someone getting seriously hurt. Grace asked Tom if she could speak with him privately, and together they stepped into the hallway outside the kitchen. She explained the situation clearly and calmly. Richard was on his way home unexpectedly, which meant they had a very short window to complete the robbery and leave the property. However, she also had a proposal that could turn this complication into an opportunity. Grace suggested that instead of rushing to finish and leave, which might lead to mistakes and increase the risk of being caught, they should use Richard's early return as a way to end the operation on their own terms. She proposed that Tom and his team should leave immediately with what they had already collected, while Grace and Marcus staged the crime scene to make it look like the robbery had happened after everyone left for the day. This approach would accomplish several important goals. First, it would eliminate any possibility of a dangerous confrontation between Richard and the robbers. Second, it would give the robbers time to leave the area completely before anyone realized what had happened. Third, it would provide a plausible explanation for how the criminals had gained access to the house and learned about the locations of valuable items. Tom was intrigued by this proposal, but he was also concerned about leaving loose ends. He asked Grace how he could be sure that she and Marcus wouldn't immediately call the police or provide descriptions that could lead to their capture. He also wanted to know why Grace was willing to help them escape, rather than simply allowing events to unfold naturally. Grace's answer revealed the depth of her thinking about the situation. She explained that calling the police immediately would likely result in a massive investigation that would disrupt everyone's lives for months. Richard would be angry and suspicious about how the robbers had learned so much about his routines and possessions. The insurance company would ask difficult questions about the security procedures and staff activities. Jennifer, Carlos, Marcus, and Grace herself would all face scrutiny and potential accusations. By contrast, if the robbery appeared to have happened when no one was home, it would be treated as a straightforward property crime rather than an inside job. The insurance would pay Richard's claims without extensive investigation. The staff would be seen as innocent victims rather than potential suspects. Everyone could return to their normal lives without the trauma and complications of a prolonged criminal investigation. Grace also made a more personal appeal to Tom. She said that she had gotten to know him and his team over the past few hours, and that she believed they were fundamentally decent people who had made desperate choices rather than career criminals who enjoyed hurting others. She said that if they could complete their operation without anyone getting hurt, she would consider it a successful resolution to a difficult situation. This conversation took place in less than 5 minutes, but it represented a remarkable negotiation between two intelligent people who found themselves on opposite sides of a criminal enterprise. Tom recognized that Grace's proposal served his interests as well as her own, while Grace demonstrated that her commitment to everyone's safety included the safety of the people who were robbing her employer. Tom agreed to Grace's plan with one modification. He wanted Grace to wait exactly 30 minutes after he and his team left before reporting the robbery to the police. This would give them time to get well away from the area and dispose of any evidence that could link them to the crime. In return, he promised that none of them would ever return to bother Richard or his staff, and that they would never share information about the house's security with other criminals. As Tom's team prepared to leave, Grace felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The immediate crisis was almost over, but now she had to implement the most challenging part of her plan, convincing Richard and the authorities that the robbery had happened without any staff involvement. Grace and Marcus quickly developed a story that would explain the crime without implicating anyone who worked in the house. They would say that Grace had left early for a dentist appointment and that Marcus had been called away to deal with a security alarm at another property. Jennifer and Carlos would say they had been running errands together and had only recently returned to find the house had been burglarized. To make this story credible, Grace and Marcus had to stage certain details carefully. They messed up Richard's study to make it look like the robbers had spent time searching for the safe. They disabled the alarm system in a way that suggested sophisticated electronic knowledge rather than inside information. They even broke a window in Richard's bedroom to provide an obvious entry point for the burglars. Most importantly, Grace had to remove any signs that she had been cooperating with the robbers rather than being threatened by them. She changed her clothes, washed her hands thoroughly, and made sure that her demeanor reflected the stress and fear that a robbery victim would naturally feel. When Richard arrived home 25 minutes later, he found Grace in the front hallway, sitting in a chair and appearing to be in shock. Jennifer was kneeling beside her, offering comfort and support. Marcus was on the phone with the police, reporting that they had just discovered the robbery upon returning to the house. Richard's first concern was for his staff. He immediately asked if anyone had been hurt, and he seemed genuinely relieved when Grace assured him that no one had been physically harmed. His second concern was for the extent of the theft, and he asked Grace to walk him through the house to assess what had been taken. As Grace guided Richard through the robbed rooms, she found herself in the strange position of having to act surprised and upset by damage that she had helped to orchestrate. She had to pretend to discover missing items that she had personally handed over to the thieves. She had to express shock and anger about violations of Richard's privacy that she had facilitated. However, Grace also found herself genuinely moved by Richard's response to the robbery. Instead of focusing primarily on his financial losses, he seemed most concerned about how the experience had affected his employees. He asked detailed questions about how Grace was feeling and whether she needed counseling or time off to recover. He seemed particularly worried about the psychological impact of the crime on Jennifer and Carlos. Richard also expressed guilt about the security measures that had failed to protect his staff. He immediately called his security company to demand an explanation for how criminals had been able to bypass his expensive alarm systems. He began making plans to upgrade the cameras, hire additional guards, and implement new procedures that would better protect the people who worked in his house. Over the following hours, as police investigators processed the crime scene and interviewed the staff, Grace found herself observing Richard in a new light. She had always known that he was a decent employer who treated his staff fairly, but she had never seen him respond to a real crisis that affected the people who worked for him. What she saw impressed her. Richard displayed genuine empathy and concern for his employees' well-being. He insisted that everyone take paid time off to recover from the trauma. He arranged for professional counselors to be available for anyone who wanted to talk about the experience. He even offered to help staff members relocate if they no longer felt safe working in a house that had been targeted by criminals. The police investigation proceeded exactly as Grace had hoped. Because there were no witnesses to interview and no evidence of inside involvement, the detectives treated it as a straightforward burglary committed by experienced professionals who had likely been watching the house for weeks. The broken window in Richard's bedroom provided an obvious explanation for how the criminals had gained entry, and the sophisticated disabling of the alarm system suggested expertise rather than inside knowledge. Richard's insurance company processed his claims quickly and without dispute. The total value of the stolen items was significant, but it represented only a small fraction of Richard's overall wealth. More importantly, the insurance adjuster agreed that the robbery appeared to be the work of outside professionals rather than an inside job involving the staff. Within a few days, life at the house had returned to something approaching normal. Jennifer resumed her duties as Richard's assistant, though she remained somewhat nervous about being alone in the house. Carlos continued preparing meals, but he insisted on keeping the kitchen doors locked when he was working alone. Marcus implemented new security procedures and spent additional time monitoring the camera systems. Grace returned to her housekeeping duties, but she found that her relationship with Richard had changed in subtle but important ways. He seemed to notice her presence more than he had before, and he occasionally asked for her opinion about household matters that he had previously handled without consulting anyone. 2 weeks after the robbery, Richard asked Grace to join him for coffee in his study. This was highly unusual, since their previous interactions had been limited to brief exchanges about practical matters. Grace wondered if Richard had somehow discovered her role in managing the crisis, and she prepared herself for what might be a very difficult conversation. Instead, Richard surprised her by asking about her background and experience before she had come to work for him. He said that during the robbery investigation, he had realized that he knew very little about the people who worked in his house, and that this seemed wrong given how much he depended on them. Grace found herself in another delicate situation. She couldn't tell Richard the full truth about her background without raising questions about why she had been so effective during the robbery. However, she could share enough information to help him understand that his staff were capable, intelligent people with rich histories and valuable skills. Grace told Richard about her education in psychology and her years working as a social worker in difficult urban environments. She explained that she had left that career after personal losses and had found peace in the simpler work of maintaining a household. She said that her previous experience had taught her to stay calm under pressure and to think clearly during crisis situations. Richard listened to Grace's story with obvious fascination and growing respect. He admitted that he had always thought of housekeeping as unskilled work that anyone could do, and that he had never considered that someone might choose such work after succeeding in a more demanding profession. He apologized for not taking more interest in his staff as individual people with their own stories and abilities. This conversation led to a series of similar discussions between Richard and his other employees. He learned that Jennifer had a degree in business administration and had previously managed operations for a small nonprofit organization. He discovered that Carlos had trained as a chef in France and had worked in several high-end restaurants before deciding that he preferred the creative freedom of cooking for a single family. He found out that Marcus had been a detective before retiring to private security work. These conversations fundamentally changed Richard's relationship with his staff. Instead of seeing them as interchangeable service providers, he began to appreciate them as skilled professionals who had chosen to work for him. He started asking for their input on household decisions and began to understand that their work required judgment, experience, and intelligence. The change was most dramatic in Richard's relationship with Grace. Having seen her calm competence during the robbery crisis, he began to rely on her judgment in ways that went far beyond housekeeping. He asked her opinion about security upgrades, staff management decisions, and even some aspects of his personal life. Grace found herself becoming something closer to a household manager than a traditional housekeeper. Richard trusted her to coordinate with other staff members, oversee maintenance projects, and handle situations that required careful judgment. He also began to confide in her about his personal challenges, including his loneliness and his struggles to maintain relationships outside of his business environment. 6 months after the robbery, Richard made an unexpected announcement to his staff. He said that the experience had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of treating employees as partners rather than subordinates. He was implementing new policies that would give all staff members more autonomy, better benefits, and opportunities for professional development within his household. More specifically, he offered Grace a new position as Director of Household Operations, with a significant salary increase and expanded responsibilities. He explained that he had come to realize that managing a complex household required sophisticated skills, and that Grace had demonstrated exceptional ability to handle challenging situations with intelligence and grace. Grace accepted the position, but she also negotiated for something that was perhaps more important to her than money or status. She asked Richard to establish an emergency protocol that would prioritize the safety of everyone in the house above the protection of property. She wanted written policies that would make it clear to all staff members that their lives and well-being were more valuable than any possessions that might be threatened by future crimes or accidents. Richard agreed immediately, and he worked with Grace and Marcus to develop comprehensive emergency procedures that emphasized de-escalation, cooperation with authorities, and protection of human life above all other considerations. These policies were shared with all current and future staff members, along with training sessions that helped everyone understand how to respond to various crisis scenarios. The robbery had lasted only a few hours, but its impact on everyone involved continued for months and years afterward. Richard became a more engaged and empathetic employer who genuinely cared about the people who worked for him. His staff gained confidence in their value and abilities, knowing that their employer respected them as intelligent professionals rather than anonymous service providers. Grace never told Richard the complete truth about her role in managing the robbery, but she didn't need to. He had seen enough of her character and capabilities to understand that he was fortunate to have someone with her skills and judgment working in his house. Their relationship evolved into something approaching friendship, built on mutual respect and trust. Years later, when people asked Richard about the most important lesson he had learned from being robbed, his answer always surprised them. He didn't talk about security systems or insurance policies or the importance of protecting valuable possessions. Instead, he talked about the incredible competence and character of the woman who had worked in his house for years, without him ever really noticing her abilities. He would tell people that the robbery had taught him that the most valuable things in his house weren't the artwork or jewelry or rare collections that had been stolen. The most valuable things were the people who chose to work for him and who brought their skills, intelligence, and dedication to their jobs every single day. He had been fortunate that it took only a crisis to open his eyes to what had been in front of him all along. Grace continued working for Richard for many years, eventually becoming one of his most trusted advisors on both personal and business matters. She never returned to social work professionally, but she found that her new position allowed her to use many of the same skills in different ways. She helped Richard develop better relationships with his employees, his family, and his community, and she took satisfaction in knowing that her influence made life better for everyone around her. The robbery had been a terrifying experience that could have ended in tragedy for everyone involved. Instead, it became a transformative moment that revealed character, built trust, and changed lives in ways that no one could have predicted. Grace's calm competence during those crucial hours had protected everyone's safety, but more importantly, it had created opportunities for growth and understanding that benefited everyone for years to come. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones who seem most ordinary, and sometimes the most valuable gifts come disguised as the most frightening challenges. The millionaire had thought he knew everything about his house and the people who worked in it. But a few hours of crisis had shown him that he had understood almost nothing at all. The discovery was humbling, but it was also the beginning of a richer and more meaningful way of living.